The humiliation was designed to look like strategy. I was sitting halfway down the conference table when the slide changed. The heading read Organizational Realignment, a phrase neutral enough to sound inevitable and vague enough to mean anything. My name appeared in smaller text beneath a section labeled Legacy Functions. Not removed. Not replaced. Just repositioned, the corporate word for fading. He didn't look at me immediately. My CEO moved through the slide the way he always did, confident, rehearsed, presenting change as progress rather than decision. When he finally acknowledged me, it was framed as appreciation. 15 years of institutional knowledge. Critical contributions. Foundational work that allowed the company to reach this stage. Foundational is what you call something you plan to build over. Then he introduced her. The future of strategic direction, he said, gesturing toward the empty chair that would soon belong to someone else. Fresh perspective. Modern execution. The language wasn't aggressive. It was final. The room absorbed the message before anyone spoke. I could feel it in the way people avoided eye contact, not out of cruelty, but adjustment. Adjustment happens quickly once narrative settles. I asked a practical question about transition timelines. My voice sounded calm enough that even I believed it. He smiled the way leaders smile when cooperation confirms their expectations. Nothing immediate, he said. We want this to feel natural. Natural meant voluntary. After the meeting, coworkers spoke to me carefully, like I had already announced something I hadn't said. The assumption moved faster than reality. It always does when hierarchy signals direction. Later that afternoon, a calendar invite appeared. Transition discussion. The duration was longer than necessary. And the title didn't include my name. The transition discussion wasn't urgent, which made it clearer. Urgency suggests reaction. This felt prepared. When I opened the invite, the description used language about knowledge transfer, continuity, and future positioning, phrases that framed departure as evolution rather than displacement. People started speaking to me differently before anything was decided. Not dramatically. Just careful. Questions about timelines that hadn't been announced. Comments about deserved rest, new opportunities, fresh starts. No one said leaving directly. They didn't need to. Narrative had already filled the space where confirmation would normally go. I spent the morning documenting processes I'd built over years, decision frameworks, reporting structures, relationships that existed more in context than in files. Writing it down felt like translating something alive into something static. Systems make sense on paper. Influence rarely does. Midway through the day, my CEO stopped by my desk. The conversation lasted less than a minute. He thanked me again for my contributions, asked how the documentation was progressing, and emphasized how important it was that the transition felt seamless. Seamless benefits everyone except the person disappearing. I nodded because resistance would shift the story from strategic change to personal difficulty. Difficulty is easier to justify removing. Later, I noticed something small in a report I was preparing to hand over. A figure that had been approved the previous week appeared slightly different in the executive summary. Not incorrect. Just positioned differently. The change favored momentum. Momentum supports narrative. I saved both versions without comment. That evening, another meeting appeared. This one labeled Leadership Alignment. My role wasn't listed. Leadership Alignment used to include me automatically. Seeing the invite without my name confirmed what the restructuring slide had implied. Removal doesn't happen all at once. It happens through absence that becomes normal before it becomes official. I didn't ask to be added. Asking reframes exclusion as oversight. Sometimes it isn't. Instead, I reviewed the materials that would be discussed, documents still routed through my system while my access remained intact. The executive summary I had noticed earlier appeared again, the revised version now positioned as final. The original wasn't referenced. Version control rarely attracts attention when outcomes remain favorable. I compared timestamps out of habit. Approval occurred after the revision, not before. The difference was small, procedural even, but it changed sequence. Sequence shapes explanation later. A colleague stopped by to ask where certain client contexts lived, assuming I would know. I showed him, watching how quickly familiarity becomes dependency once someone is expected to leave. People don't ask whether the decision is right. They prepare for it. Near the end of the day, the new replacement arrived early for onboarding conversations. She was confident without being performative, asking precise questions that suggested she understood narrative mattered as much as execution. My CEO walked her through strategy using language I recognized, not inaccurate, just simplified. Simplification creates ownership. After they left the room, I opened the alignment materials again and noticed phrasing that sounded more certain than the data supported. Not wrong. Premature. Premature certainty doesn't prove intent, but it suggests direction. My inbox refreshed. A message from my CEO requesting a draft of my resignation timeline for planning purposes. Planning had already begun. I hadn't agreed to leave. The request for my resignation timeline was phrased as coordination, not expectation. That distinction mattered less than the assumption behind it. Planning implies outcome. I reread the message twice, noticing how carefully it avoided direct language while still positioning my departure as part of a sequence already underway. I drafted a neutral response. I was documenting responsibilities, reviewing transition priorities, and would share timing once clarity existed. Clarity is a useful word when you need space without appearing resistant. Resistance invites acceleration. Throughout the day, I paid attention to how information moved without me. Conversations summarized rather than explored. Decisions referenced future alignment rather than current constraints. My absence in leadership alignment meant I was seeing outcomes instead of process. Outcomes feel inevitable when process is invisible. I returned to the revised report again, comparing how positioning changed interpretation without altering facts. Certainty had been introduced through emphasis rather than data. Emphasis guides perception more effectively than numbers alone. The replacement asked thoughtful questions during onboarding, some of which revealed how much context existed outside documentation. I answered carefully, aware that sharing information supports continuity while also confirming replaceability. Replaceability stabilizes narrative. Near the end of the afternoon, my CEO mentioned the upcoming board realignment session in passing, framing it as routine. Routine signals finality without announcement. Board conversations rarely introduce uncertainty, they formalize it. I opened my calendar and saw the session scheduled the same week my transition discussion was expected to conclude. Timing creates story. When two timelines converge, one often explains the other. My inbox refreshed again. He wanted my resignation letter drafted before the board meeting. I didn't draft the letter immediately. Writing a resignation creates psychological momentum, even when it remains unsent. Instead, I reviewed the handover materials again, noticing how often explanations were replaced with summaries. Summaries assume agreement. Agreement accelerates closure. The replacement shadowed several meetings that day, observing more than participating. Observation is how narrative is absorbed before it's repeated. I watched my CEO present strategy using familiar examples framed as directional milestones rather than collaborative outcomes. Ownership shifts subtly when attribution disappears. During a break, the replacement asked whether timelines usually moved this quickly before board sessions. The question was casual, but it acknowledged pacing. I said timing often reflects narrative readiness rather than operational necessity. She nodded like that answer made sense. I reopened earlier drafts of strategic documents and saw how language evolved across versions, tentative phrasing replaced by definitive statements once outcomes became likely. Definitive language creates the impression that decisions were obvious all along. Obvious outcomes discourage scrutiny. That afternoon, I noticed another small change in reporting materials. A projection labeled preliminary earlier in the week now appeared under confirmed trajectory. The data hadn't updated. The framing had. Framing creates confidence where uncertainty previously existed. I saved the versions again without comment. My CEO stopped by before leaving, asking whether the resignation draft was underway. His tone remained supportive, almost reassuring, as if cooperation was assumed rather than negotiated. Assumptions stabilize hierarchy. After he left, I opened a blank document and stared at the cursor. Leaving wasn't what unsettled me. It was how complete the story already sounded. Stories that sound complete rarely invite questions. Unless someone asks anyway. I started paying less attention to what decisions were made and more to when they sounded inevitable. Inevitability has a tone, confident summaries, reduced discussion, language that assumes alignment before it's confirmed. That tone had begun appearing in meetings where outcomes were still technically open. The resignation document remained blank on my desktop while I worked through transition files. Not writing it gave me distance. Distance made patterns easier to see. Reports were being positioned as validation rather than evaluation. Validation supports momentum. Evaluation introduces pause. During a routine review, I noticed a projection referenced as supporting evidence even though it had originally been created as a scenario. Scenarios explore possibility. Evidence implies conclusion. The shift wasn't incorrect. It was directional. I compared earlier presentations with recent ones and saw how the same numbers carried different weight depending on sequencing. When possibility appears before discussion, it invites input. When it appears after alignment language, it confirms decisions already implied. Sequence shapes interpretation more than content does. The replacement sat in on another meeting, listening carefully while my CEO summarized initiatives using phrasing that suggested outcomes had stabilized. Stabilization reduces uncertainty, but only if timing supports it. When stabilization appears early, it signals narrative readiness rather than operational certainty. Later that afternoon, I overheard a private conversation near an open office door, my CEO discussing board expectations with unusual confidence for metrics that were still moving. Confidence preceding confirmation doesn't prove intent. It reveals direction. Direction explains pacing. I returned to my desk and opened the resignation draft again, not to write it but to consider its timing. Leaving early would end the story cleanly. Staying long enough would show how the story was written. My calendar refreshed. Board realignment rehearsal scheduled. Board rehearsal materials were distributed to leadership but not to me. That exclusion clarified more than inclusion would have. Rehearsal is where narrative is finalized, language refined, sequencing stabilized, questions anticipated. Seeing outcomes without rehearsal context makes certainty appear effortless. I accessed earlier drafts still routed through shared systems, tracing how phrasing shifted across versions. Words like potential and projected disappeared, replaced by established and aligned. Alignment signals consensus even when discussion remains ongoing. The replacement stopped by my desk later, asking about historical reporting cadence. Her question focused less on numbers and more on how decisions were presented to the board. Presentation influences interpretation. Interpretation influences authority. I explained that sequencing mattered, introducing uncertainty early invites collaboration, introducing certainty early invites approval. She listened carefully, like someone mapping process rather than absorbing instruction. That afternoon, I noticed another example of timing shaping perception. A summary email described an initiative as board-ready hours before final inputs were submitted. Board-ready is a narrative state, not a data state. Narrative states allow momentum to continue while details follow. My CEO passed by shortly after, mentioning how smoothly the transition was progressing. Smooth transitions rely on shared assumptions. Assumptions reduce the need for explanation. I reopened the resignation draft and wrote a single line acknowledging appreciation without specifying departure. Language can create space as easily as it closes it. Later, I overheard him again, this time speaking candidly about outcomes that hadn't been formally presented. The certainty sounded familiar, not careless, just practiced. Practice creates patterns. Patterns reveal leverage. And leverage doesn't require evidence. Sometimes it requires timing. I stopped thinking about my departure as an endpoint and started treating it as a vantage point. People speak differently around someone they believe is already leaving. The urgency to manage perception fades. Explanations become shorter. Certainty arrives faster. The rehearsal deck circulated again with minor edits, but the sequencing remained consistent. Initiatives framed as emerging earlier in the week were now positioned as aligned direction. The data hadn't materially changed. The confidence around it had. Confidence influences how questions are asked or whether they're asked at all. I opened archived presentations from previous board cycles, comparing how uncertainty was introduced historically. There had been space for discussion then, language that invited interpretation rather than closing it. The current materials moved directly toward resolution. Resolution without visible exploration creates the impression that alternatives never existed. During onboarding, the replacement asked whether leadership usually presented conclusions first or process first. The question lingered because it revealed awareness. I told her process builds credibility, but conclusions build momentum. Organizations often choose momentum when timing matters. Later that afternoon, I noticed a familiar pattern again. A projection labeled scenario in earlier drafts now appeared under execution roadmap. Roadmaps imply commitment. Commitment reshapes how earlier conversations are remembered. My CEO walked past while I reviewed the deck, mentioning how important clarity would be during the board session. Clarity reduces ambiguity. Reduced ambiguity accelerates approval. I saved the versions again. Not because they proved anything, because they showed order. Order determines how explanations sound later. And explanations were starting to sound rehearsed. Once I started listening for rehearsal, I heard it everywhere. Not scripted language, but consistency, phrases repeated across different audiences, framing that stabilized meaning regardless of context. Consistency creates authority. Authority discourages interruption. I reviewed meeting notes from earlier in the quarter and saw how questions had gradually disappeared from summaries. Early notes captured debate. Recent ones captured affirmation. Affirmation suggests progression even when discussion remains incomplete. The replacement joined a strategy conversation that afternoon and watched how my CEO introduced initiatives already framed as next steps. Next steps imply decisions have occurred elsewhere. When that elsewhere remains undefined, narrative fills the gap. I asked a neutral question about timing, framing it as documentation clarity. The response emphasized alignment rather than chronology. Chronology invites scrutiny. Alignment invites agreement. After the meeting, I compared timestamps again and noticed how summaries often appeared before supporting materials were finalized. Not wrong, just ordered in a way that favored continuity. Continuity supports inevitability. Later, I overheard my CEO speaking with another executive about how smoothly the board session would go. The confidence wasn't unusual. What stood out was how little uncertainty remained in conversations where uncertainty technically still existed. Certainty had become default language. I returned to my desk and opened the resignation draft again, adding a paragraph about supporting continuity without specifying timing. Ambiguity creates leverage when assumptions already exist. My calendar updated once more. Board session agenda finalized. My farewell was listed at the end. Endings shape interpretation of everything before them. And I wasn't ready for the story to end the way it sounded. The finalized agenda made my role clear without stating it directly. Strategy, financial positioning, operational outlook, and then closing remarks from me. Closing implies conclusion even when language remains appreciative. Appreciation often precedes replacement. I reviewed the materials again, this time focusing on transitions between sections rather than the sections themselves. Each segment reinforced the next, creating continuity that suggested decisions had matured naturally. Natural progression discourages scrutiny because it feels inevitable. I drafted a version of my resignation that acknowledged timing without committing to it. Words like transition and continuity allow interpretation without confirmation. Confirmation removes flexibility. During a break, I passed my CEO's office door slightly ajar. His voice carried the same confident cadence I'd been hearing in meetings, but the phrasing was less measured, outcomes referenced as settled, risks described as manageable before supporting analysis was finalized. It wasn't incriminating. It was revealing about sequence. Sequence explains confidence. I returned to my desk and wrote notes about language differences rather than content differences. Content can be defended. Language exposes assumption. Assumption reveals direction before documentation does. The replacement stopped by later, mentioning how quickly leadership conversations seemed to move from possibility to certainty. I said certainty often reflects readiness to present rather than readiness to conclude. Presentation readiness can arrive early. That afternoon, my CEO asked again for the resignation letter, framing it as scheduling courtesy. Courtesy can accelerate narrative when resistance would slow it. I said I would bring it to the board session. He smiled. Smiles often appear when outcomes feel secured. And secured outcomes rarely invite questions. Unless someone delays delivery. Delaying delivery changed how people spoke to me. The assumption that I was leaving remained, but uncertainty about timing created a subtle shift. Conversations became more explanatory, as if context needed to be preserved before I disappeared. Preservation reveals process. I listened closely during meetings that afternoon, noticing how often certainty relied on sequencing rather than evidence. Initiatives sounded stable because they were introduced after summaries that implied alignment. Alignment reduces perceived risk. I revisited earlier drafts of the board deck and traced where language stabilized. The moment phrasing shifted from exploratory to definitive rarely coincided with new data. It coincided with narrative readiness. Narrative readiness determines when decisions feel complete. The replacement asked whether board sessions ever changed direction unexpectedly. I told her direction changes when sequence becomes visible. Visibility invites questions. Questions slow momentum. Later, my CEO passed by with unusual informality, asking if I felt ready for my next chapter. The phrasing positioned departure as personal evolution rather than organizational decision. Personal framing protects institutional narrative. I said readiness depends on timing. He nodded like the answer confirmed his expectations. That evening, I opened my notes again and saw a pattern I hadn't named yet: certainty appearing first, documentation following. The order wasn't proof of wrongdoing. It was proof of narrative control. Narrative control relies on confidence remaining unchallenged. The board session would formalize that confidence. My farewell would reinforce it. Unless the sequence became part of the conversation. And sequence was something I understood better than he realized. I stopped looking for mistakes and started looking for assumptions. Mistakes invite correction. Assumptions shape decisions long before correction is possible. The board materials didn't contain obvious errors, but they contained confidence that appeared ahead of supporting discussion. Confidence creates direction. I tested that direction during a routine check-in by asking when a particular projection moved from scenario to commitment. The answer referenced alignment rather than evaluation. Alignment describes agreement without identifying when agreement occurred. That gap matters. The replacement observed the exchange quietly, later asking whether timing usually blurred that way. I told her organizations often remember agreement more clearly than deliberation. Deliberation disappears once outcomes stabilize. Stabilization makes sequence harder to question. That afternoon, I noticed a summary email describing an initiative as expected to perform before final inputs were submitted. Expected implies inevitability. Inevitability reduces scrutiny because it reframes uncertainty as delay rather than possibility. I opened earlier correspondence and traced how phrasing evolved. Early language invited feedback. Later language referenced consensus. Consensus without visible discussion suggests readiness preceded completion. Readiness shapes perception of progress. My CEO stopped by again, asking whether the resignation letter reflected the same collaborative tone we valued internally. Tone matters because it preserves narrative continuity. Continuity avoids disruption. I said I was finalizing it. After he left, I realized something important. I didn't need evidence of intent. I needed clarity about order. Order reveals whether confidence followed process or led it. My calendar updated. Board session rehearsal complete. No questions listed. Questions are often removed when answers are assumed. Seeing a rehearsal conclude without listed questions told me more than the deck itself. Questions are where uncertainty lives. Removing them doesn't eliminate uncertainty, it eliminates space for it. Space shapes perception as much as content does. I reviewed the rehearsal notes available through shared systems and saw summaries emphasizing clarity rather than discussion. Clarity signals readiness to present. Readiness encourages agreement. Agreement stabilizes narrative. The replacement mentioned how polished the rehearsal felt despite several inputs still pending. Polished surfaces reduce the visibility of unfinished edges. When edges disappear, timelines appear cleaner than they are. I compared timestamps again, mapping when language shifted from provisional to definitive. The shift occurred before several supporting documents were finalized. Not dramatically early, just enough that confidence appeared independent of completion. Independent confidence suggests narrative priority. Later, my CEO referenced the board session casually, describing expected reactions as predictable. Predictability depends on sequence appearing coherent. Coherence discourages interruption. I opened my resignation draft and noticed how easily departure language mirrored the same pattern: appreciation first, conclusion second, explanation implied. The structure reinforced inevitability even though timing remained flexible. That realization reframed everything. My resignation wasn't separate from the narrative. It was the final confirmation of it. Confirmation doesn't require pressure when assumptions already exist. I closed the document and reviewed my notes again, focusing on where certainty first appeared rather than where it was justified. First appearances matter more than final explanations. My inbox refreshed. Board session speaking order updated. My farewell moved earlier. Earlier placement changes interpretation. And interpretation determines what questions feel possible. Moving my farewell earlier in the agenda changed its purpose. Closing remarks confirm decisions. Mid-session remarks frame them. Placement determines whether departure feels like resolution or context. Context invites questions. Resolution avoids them. I reviewed the updated agenda alongside the deck and saw how narrative flow adjusted around the shift. Strategy, financial positioning, transition acknowledgement, then operational outlook. My presence now served as bridge rather than conclusion. Bridges stabilize continuity while removing the person crossing them. The replacement noticed the change too, asking whether speaking earlier altered perception. I said sequence determines interpretation more than wording. If departure appears before projections, projections feel independent. If it appears after, they feel validated. Validation accelerates acceptance. I revisited earlier board cycles again and traced where language first sounded definitive. Definitive phrasing rarely aligned with data completion. It aligned with readiness to present. Presentation readiness is a narrative milestone, not an analytical one. Later that afternoon, I overheard my CEO describing the session as straightforward, emphasizing how aligned everything already was. Alignment without visible friction suggests inevitability. Inevitability discourages scrutiny. I compared rehearsal notes with final materials and noticed how questions had been replaced by reinforcement, slides adjusted to strengthen conclusions rather than explore alternatives. Reinforcement signals closure. Closure depends on sequence appearing natural. My resignation draft sat open beside the agenda, both documents shaping the same story. One formalized departure. The other formalized direction. Their timing made each validate the other. I realized then that challenging the outcome wouldn't change anything. Challenging the order might. Order determines whether confidence looks earned or assumed. I shifted my focus from content to repetition. Repeated phrases reveal what narrative depends on. Alignment, momentum, clarity. The same language appeared across presentations, emails, and conversations regardless of context. Consistency builds authority. Authority discourages interruption. I mapped where those phrases first appeared in drafts and saw how quickly they stabilized after rehearsal began. Stabilization before completion suggests narrative priority. Priority shapes how timelines are remembered. The replacement mentioned feeling pressure to speak with similar certainty during onboarding discussions. Certainty can be contagious when it's modeled as expectation. Expectation reinforces narrative without requiring evidence. I reviewed correspondence again and noticed how summaries referenced outcomes as shared understanding even when discussion remained limited. Shared understanding removes the need for verification. Verification slows progress. That afternoon, my CEO asked whether I planned to reference specific projects during my remarks. The question sounded supportive, but it positioned my departure as confirmation of direction rather than transition of responsibility. Confirmation strengthens narrative continuity. I said I would focus on process rather than projects. Process introduces sequence. Sequence introduces visibility. He nodded, though the answer didn't fit the script he expected. Later, I compared timestamps across the deck one more time and saw the pattern clearly. Certainty appeared, reinforcement followed, documentation aligned afterward. Alignment created the appearance of inevitability. I closed the files and opened a new document, not a resignation but notes about sequencing language. Language reveals assumptions when placed in order. The board session would rely on those assumptions remaining invisible. Visibility doesn't require accusation. Sometimes it requires timing. And timing was the one element still under my control. I stopped preparing remarks and started preparing questions. Remarks confirm narrative. Questions expose sequence. The difference isn't confrontational, it's structural. Structure determines how confidently conclusions can be presented. I reviewed the deck again and noted where certainty appeared without visible progression. Those moments weren't incorrect. They were efficient. Efficiency reduces friction, but it also compresses visibility. Compressed visibility makes timelines look cleaner than they are. The replacement asked how board members typically responded to uncertainty. I said uncertainty isn't the problem, unexplained certainty is. Boards expect risk. They question inevitability. Inevitability without process invites clarification. Earlier that afternoon, my CEO referenced the session as procedural, emphasizing that alignment was already understood. Procedural language lowers expectations for discussion. Lower expectations reduce scrutiny. I opened my resignation draft again and realized it mirrored the same pattern: appreciation first, conclusion implied, timing secondary. Secondary timing removes opportunity for reconsideration. Reconsideration depends on sequence remaining visible. I drafted 3 neutral questions tied to chronology rather than outcome. Each question asked when a decision moved from exploration to commitment. Not accusatory, just precise. Precision forces explanation. Later, I overheard a private conversation where certainty was expressed as if confirmation had already occurred. That tone wasn't unusual. What mattered was its consistency across contexts. Consistency reveals reliance. Reliance creates vulnerability. I closed my notes and saved the questions separately from my remarks. The board expected gratitude. Gratitude closes conversation. Questions extend it. And extension was the only way sequence could be seen. Identifying vulnerability required understanding confidence, not challenging it. My CEO's certainty wasn't reckless, it was practiced. He relied on narrative stability to carry decisions forward. Stability depends on timing remaining unexamined. I watched how he rehearsed language with leadership, refining phrasing to remove hesitation. Hesitation invites inquiry. Removing it creates authority. Authority shortens discussion. The replacement mentioned feeling that some outcomes sounded decided before conversations fully occurred. I told her organizations often move emotionally before they move structurally. Structural movement follows to support what already feels settled. That distinction clarified my strategy. I didn't need to disrupt the outcome. I needed to reveal when emotional certainty preceded structural confirmation. Precedence reshapes interpretation without disputing facts. My CEO asked again for the resignation letter, this time referencing board expectations for clarity. Expectations reinforce momentum. Momentum discourages delay. I said I would bring it printed. Printing creates finality. Finality reassures hierarchy. Reassurance lowers guard. Later, I reviewed rehearsal notes and saw the same pattern repeated, definitive language appearing before supporting documents were finalized. The pattern wasn't hidden. It was normalized. Normalization prevents scrutiny. I wrote one final question focused entirely on sequence, when alignment was first communicated relative to when evaluation completed. The wording sounded procedural. Procedural questions require procedural answers. Answers create record. Record creates visibility. Visibility doesn't accuse. It rearranges confidence. And rearranged confidence can change outcomes without changing facts. Printing the resignation letter felt like participating in the story rather than ending it. Paper carries weight digital drafts don't. Holding it signaled acceptance, and acceptance lowers resistance around you. Lower resistance creates visibility. I placed the envelope in my bag alongside my notes, not as a decision but as a prop. Props reinforce expectations. Expectations shape behavior. If everyone believed I was leaving, they would treat the board session as confirmation rather than conversation. I reviewed my questions again, adjusting wording to sound clarifying rather than critical. Tone determines whether sequence feels like oversight or accusation. Oversight invites explanation. Accusation invites defense. The replacement stopped by before leaving, asking whether farewell remarks usually carried strategic messaging. I told her departures often stabilize direction because they remove the person most familiar with alternatives. Alternatives create uncertainty. Removing uncertainty supports momentum. That afternoon, I overheard my CEO describing the session as predictable, emphasizing that everyone understood the direction already. Predictability depends on narrative remaining uninterrupted. Interruptions don't need confrontation. They need timing. I opened the board deck one last time and traced where certainty first appeared relative to supporting analysis. The gap was small but consistent. Consistency suggests reliance. Reliance creates exposure when examined. I sealed the envelope without rereading it. Final gestures reassure hierarchy. Reassurance encourages candor. Later, my calendar reminder appeared for the board session. I closed my notes and focused on pacing rather than content. The outcome was already written. What remained unwritten was the order. And order determines how confident a story sounds when someone asks when it became true. The morning of the board session felt quieter than previous rehearsals. Quiet often signals certainty rather than calm. Certainty reduces preparation because outcomes feel established. Established outcomes create conversational gaps where explanation would normally exist. I arrived early and watched materials being set up, noticing how the deck flowed seamlessly from strategy to transition. Seamlessness creates inevitability. Inevitability discourages inquiry. The replacement reviewed her talking points beside me, mentioning how polished everything felt despite several inputs arriving late. Late inputs don't disrupt narrative if narrative stabilized earlier. Stabilization determines what feels complete. I reread my questions once more, focusing on sequencing language rather than examples. Examples invite debate. Sequence invites clarification. Clarification produces record. My CEO greeted me warmly, thanking me again for professionalism during the transition. Professionalism reinforces narrative continuity. Continuity suggests voluntary change rather than structural shift. I handed him a printed copy of my resignation letter without comment. The gesture landed exactly as expected, reassurance confirmed. Confirmation lowers vigilance. Later, as board members began arriving, I listened to how leadership described the session: aligned, straightforward, confirmatory. Confirmatory sessions rarely expect interruption. Expectations shape reaction. I reviewed the agenda again and noticed how my remarks connected two segments that relied on inevitability remaining intact. Bridge moments carry influence because they shape interpretation of what follows. I folded my notes and placed them beside the envelope. The room filled with confidence. Confidence doesn't require evidence when sequence feels invisible. But sequence only remains invisible until someone asks when certainty actually appeared. And I was ready to ask. The board session began exactly the way everyone expected: calm introductions, measured updates, slides moving in a rhythm that suggested direction had already settled. Familiar language surfaced quickly: alignment, momentum, clarity. Words designed to reduce friction rather than invite exploration. I listened without taking notes at first, paying attention to how transitions framed certainty. Strategy flowed into financial positioning without visible hesitation. Projections were described as reinforcing trajectory rather than testing it. Reinforcement signals stability. Stability encourages approval. My CEO spoke with the same confidence I'd been tracking for weeks, referencing outcomes as natural extensions of earlier decisions. Natural extensions imply inevitability. Inevitability discourages questions because it reframes uncertainty as delay. Board members nodded in the way people do when narrative coherence replaces analysis. Coherence creates trust. Trust accelerates movement. I reviewed my questions again, not for content but for placement. Timing determines whether a question clarifies or disrupts. Clarification extends discussion. Disruption redirects it. I needed extension. Midway through the session, a projection slide appeared using language that had stabilized before supporting inputs were finalized. The sequence was subtle but consistent with everything I'd observed. Certainty first. Confirmation second. Documentation last. I felt the envelope beside my notes, a physical reminder of the role I was expected to play. Expectations shape posture. Posture shapes perception. My CEO closed the segment by referencing shared understanding across leadership. Shared understanding removes the need for chronology. Chronology introduces visibility. My speaking moment approached. The room felt settled. Settled rooms rarely expect sequence to become the subject. But sequence was the only part of the story that hadn't been rehearsed. When my turn came, the expectation was gratitude. Gratitude confirms narrative without altering it. I began that way: appreciation, continuity, acknowledgement of work that extended beyond any single role. Familiar language lowers resistance. Then I shifted. I framed my remarks around process rather than departure, referencing how clarity emerges through sequencing, exploration, evaluation, alignment. The phrasing sounded reflective rather than investigative. Reflection invites listening. Listening creates space. I asked my first question gently, tied to documentation timing rather than decision validity. When did this initiative first move from exploratory framing to align direction relative to final inputs? The wording remained procedural. Procedural questions require procedural answers. My CEO responded confidently, referencing ongoing collaboration. Collaboration suggests progression without specifying order. Order was the missing element. I asked a second question, focusing on when certainty began appearing in summaries compared to when supporting analysis concluded. The room remained calm, but attention sharpened. Sequence introduces texture where narrative appears smooth. Board members leaned forward slightly, not alarmed, just engaged. Engagement extends conversation. Extended conversation reveals pacing. My CEO answered again, emphasizing iterative alignment. Iteration explains change without identifying starting points. Starting points anchor sequence. I placed the envelope on the table without opening it. The gesture reinforced expectation while shifting focus away from departure. Expectations can coexist with questions longer than people realize. The room no longer felt settled. It felt attentive. Attentive rooms notice timing. And timing was beginning to sound different once it was spoken aloud. I asked my third question without changing tone. Tone determines whether sequence feels like curiosity or challenge. I kept it anchored in documentation when alignment language first appeared in summaries relative to formal evaluation milestones. Milestones create structure. Structure reveals pacing. My CEO answered with the same composure he'd maintained all morning, referencing collaborative momentum and leadership consensus. Consensus explains confidence without identifying when it formed. Formation was what mattered. I didn't contradict him. Contradiction creates conflict. Sequence creates comparison. I referenced timestamps available in shared materials, noting how certain phrases stabilized before several supporting documents were finalized. Not an accusation. An observation about order. The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Board members looked back at slides they had already seen, not searching for errors but reconsidering timing. Reconsideration slows inevitability. My CEO reframed again, emphasizing that alignment often precedes documentation. The statement sounded reasonable. It also established sequence explicitly: certainty first, confirmation after. Explicit sequence creates record. I thanked him for clarifying. Clarification doesn't end conversation, it grounds it. The replacement glanced toward me, recognizing the distinction without needing explanation. Distinction reshapes interpretation quietly. I slid the envelope closer to the center of the table, still unopened. The gesture maintained expectation while extending discussion. Expectations can hold longer than people anticipate when narrative feels stable. The board chair asked a follow-up about how leadership ensured evaluation remained independent of early alignment. Independence depends on visible boundaries. Boundaries rely on sequence being clear. My CEO began answering, confident as always. Confidence sounds different once timing becomes the subject. The moment arrived without confrontation. My CEO explained that strategic direction naturally guides evaluation, describing how leadership signals direction early so teams can align efficiently. Efficiency is persuasive language. It also reveals precedence. Precedents place certainty before confirmation. He spoke fluidly, reinforcing the idea that outcomes were understood before documentation finalized. The explanation sounded logical in isolation. Spoken aloud in sequence, it reframed earlier confidence as assumption rather than conclusion. No one interrupted him. Silence allowed the implication to settle. Implications carry more weight when they emerge voluntarily. I asked one final clarifying question, whether leadership considered documenting uncertainty alongside early alignment to preserve evaluation independence. The wording remained procedural. Procedural questions invite reflection rather than defense. My CEO hesitated briefly, not because the question was difficult, but because it shifted framing. Framing determines how earlier statements are interpreted. Interpretation was already moving. He responded by emphasizing trust in leadership judgment. Judgment fills gaps, sequence leaves visible. Visible gaps invite scrutiny. Board members exchanged glances that weren't accusatory, just attentive. Attention changes momentum. Momentum had carried certainty forward. Attention slowed it. I didn't reference any specific discrepancy. I didn't need to. His explanation had confirmed what sequence suggested: direction first, justification after. Confirmation creates record without confrontation. I closed my notes and rested my hand on the unopened envelope. The board chair thanked me for the perspective, noting the importance of clarity in process as much as outcome. Outcome hadn't changed, but inevitability had. And once inevitability weakens, stories stop sounding finished. The conversation didn't escalate. It widened. Widening is how narrative loses certainty without losing structure. The board chair asked leadership to walk through evaluation checkpoints in sequence, not to dispute conclusions, but to understand pacing. Pacing reframes confidence. Slides that had felt definitive minutes earlier now sounded transitional when described chronologically. Language shifted from aligned to developing, from confirmed to expected. The data hadn't changed. The order surrounding it had. Order reshapes meaning. My CEO maintained composure, explaining that early direction supports efficiency. Efficiency remained persuasive, but persuasion sounded different once independence became part of the discussion. Independence requires visible separation between certainty and confirmation. Separation had been implied, not shown. I remained quiet. Silence allows sequence to speak. Board members referenced documentation timing themselves, tracing when summaries stabilized relative to analysis completion. Stabilization appeared early. Early stabilization doesn't invalidate decisions. It weakens inevitability. The replacement added a neutral observation about how onboarding conversations relied heavily on established language before evaluation context was clear. Her tone mirrored mine, procedural, not critical. Procedural reinforcement strengthens visibility. The board chair paused the agenda briefly to request follow-up documentation outlining evaluation chronology across initiatives. Follow-up doesn't reverse outcomes. It postpones finality. Postponed finality introduces possibility. My CEO acknowledged the request smoothly, framing it as process refinement. Refinement preserves narrative while adjusting structure. Structure determines whether conclusions feel earned. I slid the envelope back toward my bag without comment. Departure had served its purpose as expectation. Expectation had created space. And space had made sequence visible. When the session concluded, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation. No reversal. Just a shift in how certainty sounded. The board deferred acceptance of my resignation pending the follow-up review, describing it as continuity rather than reconsideration. Continuity keeps options open without announcing change. I walked out of the room beside the replacement, neither of us speaking immediately. Silence after visibility carries its own clarity. The story hadn't ended. It had paused. My CEO caught up with me in the hallway, still composed but more measured than before. He thanked me for the thoughtful perspective, language careful enough to preserve hierarchy while acknowledging impact. Impact doesn't require admission. It requires awareness. I said process clarity benefits everyone. The sentence sounded neutral. Neutral statements travel further than accusations. Later that afternoon, access permissions that would have transitioned immediately remained unchanged. Calendar invites continued appearing. Conversations included me again, not fully restored but no longer concluded. Inclusion reflects uncertainty more than approval. I reopened my resignation letter once I returned to my desk and noticed how final it had sounded before sequence entered the conversation. Final language depends on inevitability. Without inevitability, language becomes provisional. I saved the document without sending it. He had believed the board session would close my chapter. I walked in carrying that expectation because it created the moment where sequence could be spoken aloud. The confession wasn't a recording or a document. It was explanation, certainty described before confirmation. He thought I was leaving. Instead, he confirmed the story that made leaving impossible to finalize. Sometimes leverage isn't proof. Sometimes it's timing. And timing had changed everything.